Welcome to another episode of the MacGuffin podcast, the movie review podcast that dreams are made of. From San Diego, California, I have my co-host, Keith Foster.
And you are Cassidy Robinson, and you are recording from an undisclosed location in the Rocky Mountains. And I believe we have a special guest with us on this episode.
Yes, joining us today from California, Los Angeles, California, my old friend Alec Engerson, who I went to grad school with. He was, I believe you were a year younger than my class, but...
I'll tell you even more. Actually, I did not go to grad school. I was an undergrad when we met, and I'm so fucking smart. So, am I allowed to curse on this?
Yeah.
I am sorry. Worth checking. They always check on, I don't know. I'm just so smart and talented that I took grad school classes. I don't think they let people do that normally.
You were in a lot of our classes. That's why I assumed you were just a year under us. But we specifically brought you on today because, of course, one of the big news items film-wise of the summer has been around the writer's strikes and the, is it the production? Which guilds are striking currently?
Currently, WGA, which is the Writers Guild of America, and SAG, which is the Screen Actors Guild, are both striking. DGA, which is the Directors Guild, has signed a deal.
They settled, yeah.
Yeah, they took a deal.
Yes.
And you've been somewhat involved in the strikes. We have a picture down here that I pulled from your social media of you at one of the strikes, and you've been working in television, and I believe you've had some screenplays you've worked on and things as well.
Yeah, I can give you. I'll give you my quick spiel. So yeah, I've been working now for about 10 years. Almost nonstop in entertainment in various capacities. Originally in post-production is where I cut my teeth. Luckily enough to transfer into live shows eventually, and then eventually production, then development. I spent about 4 years as a development executive for a production company with an overall deal at Disney, and before that, a production company with a first look deal at Sony. I developed projects for other people for a very long time and eventually decided to focus on my own career. So like a little over a year and change, I left my development job and focused on writing, became very fortunate and ended up working on the show True Lies, which was for CBS. It was a procedural adaptation for broadcast television based on the James Cameron film of the same name. And yeah, I worked on it as the showrunner's assistant. The showrunner is Matthew Nix. I've never called him Matthew before. I don't know why I said that. Matt Nix. And he created, most famously, probably Burn Notice and The Gifted for Fox and The Good Guys as well. Matt ran the show. We aired for one season on CBS and Paramount Plus. We are canceled, so it's done. But it was a lovely time, and I was very fortunate to be a big part of the show and be allowed to do a lot for it. I'm very glad and lucky for my experience there.
Yeah, and I believe you also are signed to...
Yeah, so then, also me as a writer, I am signed to an agent at Gersh, Lyra Tan, who I'm very appreciative of. And if she listens to this, thank you, Lyra. I love you. You're amazing. And Dowslyn Lamb, who I feel very much the same about, huge supporters of me. And I'm grateful that they believe in my work. Prior to that, I've also sold projects to Lifetime, and that's really actually the only thing I should talk about. But was fortunate enough to meet with some really cool production companies and talk about some new shows to get into, hopefully, after the strike.
Yeah, which, insider knowledge, you've been on the picket line. I'm sure you know more about like the goings on of, whatever you're allowed to divulge about deals that may or may not come soon. where does it look like they're at right now in terms of settling?
Yeah. Okay. So for my own, I don't know, like sense of honesty and safety and stuff, I am not a spokesperson for the WGA. Nothing I say is necessarily representative of the guild at large, and I am not on the negotiating committee, and that should be very clear. So I've never been in the negotiating room. Most WGA members are not in the negotiating room. We have a team of negotiation committee leaders who are our leadership here. They are having all the conversations, and they divulge information to us when they can, when it's appropriate, when it's in the best interest of the guild. I'm a, pretty firm believer in guilds and the importance of them. I think our leadership has done a really good job of making our demands very clear and talking us through which ones are important and why. And there have been, the truth of the matter is, I'm sure you guys have seen the movie like Blue Collar and stuff like that. Or Madawan or Huron County. Essentially what I'm trying to say is, anytime there is a massive collection of people who are not the people in power, it's extremely hard to make everybody be on the same page about something. Mm-hmm. And there will always be infighting and conflict and debate internally about which things are more important than others. So I have my own parts of our, proposed contract that I think are really important. And then other people have parts that they think are more important. And we might not be aligned, but I do believe we have pretty incredible solidarity as a guild, and along with SAG, who is a partnering guild for the strikes. And yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. And, just going into that a little bit, even though you're not a WGA member yet, what does Alec Engerson, non-representative of the guild itself, what are your biggest fears or worries or priorities coming into negotiations?
Or hopes and optimisms? What do
Sure.
you think? Yeah.
Yeah, Keith, you don't know me super well. I am not an optimistic person. That said,
it's pretty bleak right now, so I was just throwing that out there.
Look, that said, like, for me, and I think for almost anybody who's on the lower level of the spectrum of writing jobs, like, just to break it down, a writer's room typically has levels, and a big enough room will have more clear diversity in the levels, but essentially the lowest level writer you can be, as a writer on a show, is a staff writer. Above that is a story editor, eventually executive story editor, co-producer, producer, supervising producer, co-EP, and EP, and showrunner. Not every show is going to have every one of those jobs. True Lies, we had 4 staff writers, 1 co-producer, 1 producer, 3 co-EPs, and Matt Nix, the showrunner. So we were about 10 people. Our seconds were a writing team, so paycheck-wise, we were 9 people. Mm-hmm. But that was our room size, and that was our breakdown. For me, and like I said, everyone basically below producer level, the priority is surely room staff minimums. For a lot of reasons. I mean, the most basic being this issue of mini rooms that has become a thing in the last few years, probably between 5 and 10, but I didn't look that up, so no one should quote me. But the mini room is a small group of writers, sometimes 3, sometimes 2, with a shortened time. A writer's room can go about 20 weeks to 40 weeks, depending on how long the show is and the series order. These mini rooms are typically 5 weeks and 3 writers, and they've just made it exceptionally hard for lower level writers to work, partially because if you only have 3 slots, you're reasonably, as a showrunner, inclined to find people who will be the most helpful for you. And if producer level people are willing to take a kind of a pay cut for these shortened rooms to do it, it's hard for low level people to compete with them. despite people's best wishes and hopes, Hollywood is not a meritocracy. You do not get, you're just because you're an amazing writer does not mean you're going to be working. Not that I'm making that as an excuse for myself. I think I'm a very fine writer, but I think for a lot of low-level people, it becomes very hard to get into a room that only has 1 or 2 slots.
Right.
So I think our big push is for these room minimums, and the negotiating committee has made it clear that it's a very big point that they are devoted to. I'm choosing to believe that them 100% and that is true. And I think part of what is emphasizing how crucial it is that it also seems to be the thing that's in the news the most and attacked the most. I don't think that's an accident. I mean, Variety, Deadline, a lot of these publications are owned by members of the AMPTP, which is the organization negotiating on behalf of the studios. They have made it pretty clear. In fact, actually today, an article came out about it, about how showrunners don't really want it. And another thing that's important to say, besides that I am not a representative and no one should listen to me, is that the WGA has a media blackout during negotiation, which has restarted. We finally have started negotiation again. So we are not saying anything to the press until it's done. So nothing that comes out into the press is actually sanctioned word. It is not necessarily even true. It should not be fully believed until it is corroborated by the WGA and the AMPTP. So I just want to make that clear.
No,
and then with
that
the
makes
coming
sense.
issue, well, I just also want to emphasize that articles read from Deadline and Variety are also not necessarily factually based. Like, besides not taking my word, I'm extending that you should not take any news publication's word, because the WGA has no conversation with the media right now. It's media blackout.
And from what I understand, a big part of and this might just be me speculating here, but from what I understand, that seems to be kind of a tactic of AMPTP, is trying to control the narrative, because they feel like they are in this position of holding all of the cards, and the labor force is telling them, no, you don't. We need these things to continue working.
Yeah, and I think the fact that they've signaled this out as such a focal point of the media emphasizes its importance. It's really just about protecting jobs. I mean, a ton of jobs have minimums, and any job that's done safely also typically will have a minimum. There's a reason that there have to be 2 pilots in a plane.
Right.
If you're very shrewd and completely profit focused, you'd be like, well, fuck that, man. One dude, and he doesn't even have to be there the whole time. Like, you could hire a pilot for an hour, then take him off the clock for autopilot, and then put him back on the clock for the landing if you were a real piece of shit. But we don't do that because it's not safe, it's not effective, it's not the smartest way to do that. And the same is true of writing. I'm not saying that writing is such a dangerous job, but being a showrunner is a hard job. It pays well, and there are good elements to it, but it's hard.
And it is a craft, right? It is an artistic craft.
I mean, it makes sense where you're talking about, if you just look at the WGA, or you look at how a writer's room typically works versus what they'll be pushed into if said people had their way with it. It's just a microcosm of everything else. You're talking about skeletal staffing. That happens at Walmart. That happens on
happens
the
everywhere.
Factory
it
floor.
Happens at every labor. I mean, that's the purpose of unions, right? Is to protect the workers from exploitation, from the people who are so far removed from it, and this idea that once money is achieved at a certain level, you can cut out the actual labor that creates whatever industry it is. That's the point. That is the entire point of the union, is to protect the workers, to make sure working conditions are safe and functional, like you.
Right. And not for nothing, but ultimately this will have better outcomes for the product. I mean, you're going to have a better show, and where you have more people in the room being able to work on it, and they're less stressed and they're less pressed for time. They're going to be more creative, not less. So it should be a win-win if people don't think short-sightedly, but I mean, that's never how it goes.
No, of course not. And the worst actors that, make me want to fight people on LinkedIn, which is a crazy sentence. It will emphasize this idea that, oh, thank God AI has come, because it is going to make art better. Because all these shows the last 5 years have been so bad, it can't get worse if it's AI. That's like a recurring statement that I've been hearing a lot. And I would just challenge that thinking in the politest way possible, as I hold all my fucking rage inside, to say, if you feel shows have gotten worse, which I'm not even saying they are, I think that there's very hard to have any kind of conversation about if things are worse in general. But if you do think shows have gotten worse, I would challenge you that it is more likely a result of mini rooms and shrunken writers' rooms and a lack of writers on set than it is writers are bad now. Because if you were to imagine this idea of a room of people who are writing episode after episode after episode of show under incredible stress and time, when there's 3 people and 5 weeks to write it, and then by the time they're done writing it, they're gone for about a month between writing it and it's shooting. Let's just say this is a very popular practice. Like, writers who are done with a show before it films, they have one writer on set, usually the showrunner, maybe a producer. Right. The amount of pressure that these very few people are under is maybe not making them make the best work they can. And again, I'm not trying to excuse, some shows are bad for a plethora of reasons. This is not the only reason. But I would just challenge those people who feel things are bad to understand that we think our fixes will help that. And I think that. And yeah, it's hard to have these conversations without bringing up AI. Obviously, it's a big part of the conversation right now.
Right. We didn't even get into that. And, I know also, that has been a big part of the negotiations.
So when I bring up the execs, part of why I bring it up is not to belittle the job or make it seem easily replaceable. It's to say, the execs who are quiet now because they're worried about their job currently, I do think it's worth being supportive and speaking out for writers, because Absolutely. You are as replaceable, if not more. It's why, shout out Gersh and Rain, my reps, and a bunch of other reps. Verve and WME, a bunch of them have done amazing things right now. They're exceptionally on our side, because the truth is they can't get 10% of nothing. So they're aware of what the issues are.
Nobody wants a strike, right? Nobody, even at AMPTP, they don't want to have zero content you know what I mean?
Of course.
That's why it's as a complete outsider frustrating to watch, because it's the answer is so obvious. It's so obvious. Just treat people fairly. And I think once that finally clicks, once that finally sticks, we will hopefully be able to find a way forward with a solution. It's not that all producers are evil. It's that everybody is trying to find a way that moves the industry forward, with the least amount of bullshit.
The other things we're getting onto today, we're gonna review Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Mutant Mayhem. Kind of changing gears a little bit, and then for the streaming homework, you brought to the table Ghost Dog, the Jim Jarmusch film, which we watched on HBO Max, which I believe
I watched on the Criterion channel.
Yeah, Criterion released it. HBO Max has a deal with Criterion, so there's a lot of stuff from Criterion you can watch on HBO Max currently. But
they had the little Criterion stinger on HBO before I watched it. I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah,
right. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Criterion put out the this hip hop playlist this month, so that was also part of what went into my brain.
Right, which also ties in really nicely with TMNT. All right, so if you would like to just give us a quick rundown of what Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem is about, with no spoilers.
Okay, sure. Yeah, it's a reimagining of the classic comic book, animated and film series, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. In its most broad terms, it is about a group of turtles who are brothers. While they were normal, everyday turtles, they got their way into some chemical ooze that transformed them into mutants. They became quite tall and able to talk, and were raised by their father, who is a rat named Splinter, who is also affected by the ooze and is voiced by Jackie Chan, and is trying to keep them safe in a world suspicious of anything other. How's that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think essentially, that is the core canon of all things Ninja Turtle. There have been some adjustments or changes to this specific adaptation.
Absolutely.
For one, this is one of the first Ninja Turtle properties that I can think of that really emphasizes them as teenagers, in some cases preteen.
Well, this is the first time that they have actually been represented by teenagers. The voice actors themselves are teenagers, and that is new to the franchise.
Right. It's not
Cassidy's point, though. We've almost always ignored the teenager element of them, right? They've
it's always
very
been
tall, very large, very adults.
And I think this aspect of them sort of like wondering about their future and having this want for the outside world, this aerial part of your world sort of fantasy, and wanting to join the human world.
It's these very relatable, especially in your teenage years, this very relatable idea of wanting to not be an outsider, to be included, and to feel like you have some connection to a world larger than, in this case, a sewer.
Yeah, whereas before, in the other previous Turtles iterations that I know of, there have been many since I was a kid, but part of the reason they were ninjas is because of the art of being able to hide or to escape, and they use that in a lot of ways to stay secret. And they never, with the exception of wanting to hang out with April, that never seemed like a big part of their narrative as it is here. And I think
the comics started back in the 80s, around when you and I were born. Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird created one of the most successful independent comic books ever made. With they were just in their fucking garage or basement or whatever, drawing these Ninja Turtle cartoons. It sold as a cartoon, and then this generation in the late 80s, early 90s was introduced to it by the original movie, which was, produced by the Jim Henson Company. Also, at the time, the most successful independent film of its time. Huge.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Hugely successful cartoon on Saturday mornings. And it has, I mean, say what you will about the Ninja Turtles. It has had legs, and a big part of that is its ability to reinvent itself. There was the Jim Henson movies, there was the 80s and 90s cartoon, there was the late 90s, early 2000s cartoon, there was the cartoon movie, there has been, the Michael Bay live action movies. I think by embracing this idea of reinvention, that each incarnation of the Turtles is like, this is its own thing. We're not beholden to whatever has existed before. To me, that's sort of written into the world of, it's constantly reinventing itself. It's existed for so
unless we're specifically trying to go for a nostalgia effect or a period piece or something like that. They have to reinvent. And the way that this movie does specifically is these group of turtles are really plugged into the internet. They're looking at their phones. They're experiencing the world virtually. And there's something, I don't want to get too heady about a Turtles movie, but there's something almost kind of...
Let's do it, man.
Yeah, why not? Fuck it.
There's something almost sort of post-COVID about this movie, this idea of, being stuck in one place and not being able
growing up in isolation and having access to this sort of past world and past media and seeing this world that feels like it's existing without you. Like I can absolutely see a post-COVID youthful generation connecting with that as a story.
Right. I mean, the 2 years or so for a lot of kids who the way they hung out with their friends was on Zoom. And the way that, there's the overall theme of the movie, being, yes, wanting to be accepted and wanting to belong to something, but also this sort of FOMO theme.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Of course, which is, we could say it's COVID, or we could just say maybe even exacerbated by kids who grew up completely with social media. I mean, we're the last generation that was not raised with the internet already existing, right? Or at least, obviously it's existed for quite a while, but in the form that we know it now, where it's in everyone's house and pocket, like we're the end of that. Everyone else has grown up with a different version of it. And not to say I think that that's necessarily like the most important theme of the film, but it is an interesting element of it. And something that, just to speak generally of movies like Turtles and genre, why I write mostly genre and what I think attracts me and a lot of people to genre is that you connect so deeply with the monster, right? It's something Guillermo del Toro talks about a lot. It's something anyone like me who's ever in a general meeting with a production company is going to talk about. But the idea of, if you've ever felt othered in any kind of capacity, you see yourself in the monster, you see yourself in the freak. And I think, I think we all have our things that make us feel othered, some people more than others. I had plenty of for myself growing up. And so Turtles were extremely fascinating to me. Oh, what's this group of people who are pretty dope, but no one really knows how dope they are, or doesn't trust them because they look a certain way or act a certain way, or feel a certain way.
And this idea of like dependency on those closest to you who are the most like you. But on the B plot side of it, plot with a capital P, you have the whole situation of Baxter Stockman, who had created a mutant fly. Now, instead of being the fly himself in this version, he had mutated a fly who becomes Superfly, voiced by Ice Cube, and who is has a host of other mutant criminals that he hangs out with, Bebop and Rocksteady. I don't know. I recognize about half of them from the toys. But
oh man, I mean, okay, we got Wingnut, we got Mondo Gecko, we got Genghis Frog, we got Leatherhead, we got so many fucking turtle toys in here.
And they are working for Superfly in some plot to harvest more ooze to level the playing field, as it were.
Essentially, the plot of X-Men 1, right? It's the X-Men 1 story of Magneto is going to...
Amazing Spider-Man 1.
Everybody other than all of a sudden we fit in.
Right.
Yeah, a reverse syndrome or something even too. I guess actually just what Syndrome is doing, and incredible. It's a tried and true plot device. I guess would be the way to say it.
It's this idea of trying to be included through violent, reprehensible means.
Right. Yeah. At a point, the Turtles sort of come into contact with them, and they come to a moral crossing point of, well, here's a bunch of people who are like us and who are doing just fine. They've figured something out. Or do we want to try and make it work with the humans, mostly represented by April O'Neil, who is voiced by that girl from The Bear.
Io Edebiri.
Yes. And she's playing a high schooler here. She wants to get on staff with the school editorial page or the news. So it's a version of a reporter, like she has been seen in other media, but again emphasized
in this case, she is kind of paralleling she's in high school. She also is part of this sort of coming of age story. She hasn't fully come into her career as reporter yet, as we knew her from the old cartoon and the old movies. But this, she is also growing the same way the Turtles are.
There's an aspect of this movie that is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Year One.
Absolutely, yeah.
While going its own path.
For my money, it's maybe the best characterization of the Turtles and April put to the screen.
We're kind of getting into my first big critique of the movie, which, for what it's worth, I like the movie quite a bit. And I'll get into my reasons why I like the movie. But to start just with the stuff that I don't think worked as well, I don't think there's a lot of characterization.
Give it one compliment before. Let's compliment Sandwich a little bit. Give it one nice thing before we get into it.
Well, I love looking at it. I mean, the animation, the character design, the style, the lighting, the production design, the soundtrack by Atticus Ross and Trent Reznor, one of their best to date. The soundtrack on top of it.
Way harder than they needed to for a Ninja Turtles movie.
Oh, and
holy shit.
It paid off big time. So, compliment Sandwich. I on an artistic level, this movie is perfect. One of my biggest problems with it is, besides Donatello, who he has a higher voice and glasses, and they play a little bit into the nerdy thing, and Leonardo as being sort of the reluctant leader of the group, and them sort of like teasing him all the time. Other than that, the group dynamic feels kind of non-existent. They sort of gel into just one entity the whole movie, and I feel like
we're doing the same head, Bob.
I just watched Keith and me move our head the exact same way
because I disagree. I felt like they did such a you have Leonardo as this kind of young tryhard. You have a young scientific mind with Donatello, who is constantly figuring things out in this. And they always, I felt like, did it in these fun, like, sort of action-y set piece ways. They are constantly referring to Raphael and his testosterone levels.
They say it, but I didn't see it. Like, what are you talking about?
Every fight, he was like the first to run in there. I completely disagree. The one I will say I felt like a little was downplayed was Michelangelo, because typically Michelangelo has sort of been like the comedic relief.
Right.
And I will feel like in this version, they are all so young that I did not feel that as much. But I felt like the rest of the Turtles characteristics shine through in albeit maybe more modern ways. But I still felt like they all had unique, distinct voices.
Okay, I mean, I just felt like I personally would have liked to take a beat individually with them at some point in the movie, just to give them a bit more than their function in the plot.
Sure.
Yeah, a lot of the time they're working so cohesively, and they're all kind of pitched similarly as far as their enthusiasm, that they sort of felt indistinguishable from scene to scene, other than their colors, obviously, and
that's so interesting. So
what they were given to do within an action set piece.
That's very interesting. I say it's interesting because I have a friend, when I asked who's your favorite turtle, his response was, "Are they different?" Because he had seen the live action films, and maybe that was it, but he at least had a cursory knowledge, and I was very confused by that because in my mind they'd always been so different. And I said this earlier, but I really do think this movie's maybe the best characterization of them as TMNT, as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that we've gotten.
I am inclined to agree with you, Alec. I feel like they were played younger, yes, and I can kind of see where Cassidy's coming from in that they felt more familial than maybe they have in past incarnations. But for my money, I still felt like all of their personalities very much came through. And I thought that for me, it was refreshing to see them sort of work all of these things together as a cohesive unit versus sort of pitching each individual toy, which maybe the cartoon did a little bit more than this did. But
the movie, I think the original 1989 New Line Cinema version.
The one, it was a little more dark. It was a little more adult. Jim Henson did the fucking incredible animatronic facial work, and but even then I actually feel like these turtles are more unique than those turtles, except like in the original 89 movie, if you really look at it, you have Raphael as this sort of dissident. You have Leonardo as the, come on guys, I'm the leader of the group. And I feel like Michelangelo and Donatello just kind of sat off to the sidelines and, sort of provided comedic relief. I feel like this movie, the 2023 Mutant Mayhem, does more to give them each individual voices than maybe any incarnation of the Turtles we've seen, except for the theme song, which told us that Donatello does machines, Michelangelo's a party dude, Raphael's cool but rude.
And I'll say this as to not just beat up on Cassidy's opinion here, but like, if you were a Michelangelo fan, if he's your number one, maybe I could totally see wishing he had another moment in this film to shine. I
wish all of them did.
I have a friend who is his name is Mike Brown. He's been on the podcast before. His favorite turtle was Michelangelo because Mikey. And I guarantee you he lost his shit
Oh yeah.
when Michelangelo talked about doing improv. Like,
Oh
I
my
guarantee you.
Yeah.
Like,
But that's what I mean. Like, I feel like it was maybe a little more subtle or a little more baked in versus like this is the character and this is their one thing that defines them. I felt like they had these individual personalities, but by treating them as truly teenagers and casting them as this familial unit, maybe it's just a little less on the nose.
I mean, oddly, it's slightly less cartoony. All right.
Yeah.
Like, it's a very cartoonish thing to give everyone kind of one thing and be like, that's your deal. They do feel very similar a lot of the time in the way that I think any family is similar. Brothers can be similar with key differences.
Yes. I feel like it's weirdly less broad.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, other opinions are available. I think part of the reason they feel the way they do, or the way the dynamic is a little bit more compressed, is because the movie as a whole is a little bit more compressed because it's moving a lot more. It's
Yes.
because it's animation. Because the budget is probably, I would say, significantly higher than previous Turtle incarnations. The movie
compared to
is
the Bay produced ones. No. I mean, compared to the Michael Bay produced films, not even close. But just in animation, yeah. It's a $70 million movie, so I mean, I'll guarantee you it's more than any made-for-TV movie. Yeah.
For sure, and I think that the style of the movie comes a lot in the way that it's paced and edited, and the way shots are designed, and the way the set pieces are sort of fluid, and we could make the comparison to the Spider-Verse movies because I think that is their closest analog. It's stylistically, but
totally.
Yes and no. I'm going to put a little asterisk on that because I want to hear what you have to say, but I want to come back to that.
Well, I meant just in the way that they move. We talked a lot about when we did the last Spider-Verse movie that that movie so cleverly weaved in story and plot along with action set piece. I think this movie doesn't quite braid those ideas as well, but it's a big part of what it's going for stylistically.
I don't want to say I'm going to disagree with you, but I want to just set aside like a minute to gush about the animation.
No,
here.
Please do. Because I think that's the takeaway of the movie for me.
Well, I feel like it's very easy to compare it to Spider-Verse, right? Because it exists outside of this world of animation that we have been a part of for so long, right? It exists outside of Pixar and DreamWorks and Disney. It looks sketchy. It looks intentionally rough. The character designs are oddly shaped and weird and a little gross. But what I'm going to challenge you on is that I think it is actually very different than Spider-Verse. I think Spider-Verse is this idea of sort of encompassing every animation trick we've ever known into a cohesive story, which in and of itself is a miracle. To me, this feels very, it feels cartoony in a way that is meant to elicit this sort of sketchbook vibe. You have these backgrounds that are sort of rendered more in abstraction a lot of the times. A lot of the style has this kind of sketchy, cartoony, shape forward look that I think it is easy to make the comparison to Spider-Verse because it Spider-Verse references animation that looks like this, but to me, this is a singular vision that looks specifically like this. Like the whole movie looks this way of written in the margins of a notebook, but with the polished animation that comes from
3D modeling.
Incredible amounts of effort to take these ideas of like, okay, what if we take this face and it looks a little sketchy and not exactly representational, but then we render it fully and make it a character. Like, what if we incorporate that into the design?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is operating on a different level than Spider-Verse. And I agree that Spider-Verse is more ambitious just because it is drawing from every possible idea of animation for the past 100 years. But to me, this is a more specific and unified artistic direction
Sure,
that I think is worth making the distinction of.
I mean, I think to be fair, this movie, whether this movie gets made is, I think, in debate if Spider-Verse does not exist. So I do think purely from like a business standpoint, the comparison is fair because I truly don't see this necessarily. And look, maybe. Yeah.
No. I agree with you completely. I've been saying that since the first Spider-Verse came out, it is going to completely change the landscape of animation in that now we know what's possible. And I do agree with you that this could not exist in this version without Spider-Verse sort of breaking those walls down. But I just feel like it is worth mentioning that to me, this is much more specific and
it's not a one for one. I wasn't trying to say that. I think what I mean is that they're both kind of going for this sort of tactile pop art aesthetic.
What is animation truly capable of? Can we incorporate 2D and 3D? Can we incorporate
at the same time?
Yeah, and you know, I think both of them are rebellious in that way. Like, right?
Yeah.
You know, they're saying, hey, like, not to diminish, but like you've gotten very used to a certain aesthetic with animation. Obviously, the Pixar 3D animation has been very prevalent for a long time. And that's not to say that there weren't movements away from it, but it's obviously been such a massive part of American culture.
Yeah.
You know, The Last Wish, the Puss in Boots movie, was also kind of similar to this style and I think very effective for it. But I think Spider-Verse and this saying like, hey, animation is a lot of things. Like in the same way, no comic book is going to be drawn the same way a comic book was drawn. No animation needs to be exactly the same way. And also fuck you for being the popular thing, right? Like I think that's inherently part of it. I think the rebellious nature of it is important to the story thematically, and then just the creators, you know, I mean, Evan and Seth are a big part of it as well.
And I like that this movie, again, just to gush on it, is a little bit gross. It's a little dirtier. It's a little less polished. Like, you know, the character designs are intentionally sometimes a little wonky and a little abstracted and a little oblong, and you get a lot of shape leading character versus shape sort of carved away down to character, and there's sort of a rawness to it that I think captures that sort of original feel of the indie comic book. You know, we just did this in a garage without a lot of technical training kind of vibe that the original comics had.
And perhaps more honest to a characterization of New York and humans.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so that, you know, there isn't a strong push to make anything feel like sleek and sexy. You know, that's not to say like none of these characters are fuckable, but it's just more to say like they were like, hey, like what if these people looked like people, and what if the people who aren't people looked like kind of gross and weird, but you had an affinity for them anyway.
Right. Even if something is using a sort of sketchy, crosshatchy, ink-blotty look, it always looks like a finished product. It doesn't look like it was a rush job or anything like that. It's always understood as part of the aesthetic. And it going into what Alex said, it kind of pulls up the feel of that sort of grungy late 80s New York without just doing that.
And I guess I should also emphasize that I am from New York. So
okay.
I'm not from the city. My mom's from Brooklyn. I'm from Long Island. I spent my childhood as a New York kid. And so for me, this movie, and when we get to Ghost Dog, an element of it too, is, hey, how did this feel? Did this feel authentic to a reality? And Spider-Verse does as well. And just taking it out of the conversation for a second, watching Turtles, my thought was, hey, does this capture the vibe, the energy? Is it how I would have loved to see New York represented when I was a kid? Is this how I would like to see a group of teenage turtles represented as a kid? And for me, as a young-brained individual at that time, and then transported back to my young brain while watching the movie, it kind of hit everything I could really ask for it. And I'll take it even further. And if I'm going to criticize the movie, I will say I was hit with this feeling probably with about 20 minutes left into the movie. I was hit with two things. One, I was going, oh man, this is almost done. That's wild. It does wrap up rather quick. But the other thing being, is this so made for me that it doesn't ring authentic to other people? And I bring that up only to say, like, look, again, for anyone who doesn't know me, like, I was like a hoodlum, right? Like, my dad was a criminal. My mom worked at Nordstrom selling clothes. I grew up broke, and I was a skate rat. I used to skate everywhere and steal shit and spray paint shit. Like, I was like very much the type of person that this caters towards. And I loved hip hop, and like, I love Fresh Prince, and I loved hip hop, and I loved TV, and I loved comics, and I loved all this entertainment. And it led to me eventually being in entertainment and being a development exec for a company that focused almost entirely. It was a creator-driven company, but it was a company that focused almost entirely on Black and queer content. And so, that wasn't an accident. I ended up there because of my personality. And when watching this, if I am to criticize at all, I was hit with this moment of, this is so for me. I wonder if it rings true for anyone else. Like the No Diggity montage, which I think is fucking amazing. Like, so great. All the music cues, Tribe, all of that, even putting Ice Cube in the movie, which, like, I know we could kind of step aside as problematic elements of him as a personality, but just as a artist and performer, putting him in the film, even though he's a West Coast rapper, his energy's pretty attuned with what again, it just felt like it was pandering to me, which is not a complaint, because I benefit from it. But it was a concern I had, where I was like, oh my God, is this so pandered for me that anyone else would be like, nah?
I'm going to answer you in I mean, obviously I cannot speak for the mass audiences in general. I also got that sort of feeling. And I think, to me, that is the strength of this movie, is that it is able to capture this sort of nostalgia. Like, to me, I was like, this felt like playing with Ninja Turtles toys. Like, it felt more like that than any other Ninja Turtles media I have ever experienced. Was just like that feeling of sitting down with your friends and playing with toys and fighting a giant, gross monster whale fly thing.
And I guess to your point, Keith, like, if it captures an energy and does it well, and has an energy that is exciting for kids, maybe this specific reference isn't important. I guess to say, just to again speak like super frankly, this is the first time that a Turtles movie committed to the idea that the Turtles could be Black, and like cast half of the voice actors as Black. Yeah. And I don't want to be like the three white dudes having the conversation about race in the Turtles movie, but I do think it's worth bringing up that this is one of the first times they really kind of, at least semi-committed to that energy. I mean, April's been Black for a while, and Omar Benson Miller did voice Raphael in Rise, so it's not insane, but it's an interesting element. Yeah,
but it's a first time where they specifically were trying to make them feel like young like young urban teenagers in New York City. And when you do that, you're going to want to cast more diversely than just 4 white mid-40s voice actors. You're going to want, you know what I mean? Like, you want some authenticity with that. And I think that's where that comes from.
I think the word that we've used so much in this review is specifically. And I think, I've often stated the more specific you make something, the more universal it becomes. So even if it isn't, going back to your question, Alec, about will this make sense to anybody who didn't have your same background?
Does it feel authentic to people who have that background now is, I guess, kind of more what I'm saying. Because it's so tailored to my version of that story that I'm curious if you're like, and I guess you don't have to be a black teen in New York, but it's just the energy for sure. It seems to be trying to occupy that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to speak
real to them.
I think it's going to speak to an inner city audience different than it is a rural or a suburban. But I do think that people want to see things that aren't them. People do want to. I mean, they want to see them. They want to be represented, but they also want to go to the movies to
people want to be able to see themselves in things that are not themselves.
Right.
Like, we grew up about as far removed as New York as you could get, but I still loved the Ninja Turtles.
Sure. Well, I mean, a lot of people did. It was like one of the most...
Exactly. That's my point, right? Like,
it was one of the most popular...
generation of us...
Yeah.
But that's my point. An entire generation of us grew up with these characters that belong to the city. And because of that, we could feel connected to this larger idea, to this larger world. I felt like while watching the movie, that was at the forefront. Not, will kids like this? I think kids will like this because it is authentic. It is real. It is unique.
And it's fun. I mean,
Yes, yeah.
I don't think they even have to think about the movie in those terms. I think that's working subjectively, or that's working subversively. But I think ultimately, is it entertaining? Is it working as a story? Can they connect to the characters? And as far in terms of animation goes, is it competitive with what else is happening out there? And I think more than exceeds most of it, with the exception of maybe the Spider-Verse movies. I mean, this movie is wholly original to look at. And I just loved, just taking in whole sections of the film as moving tableau, even if I wasn't always like super hyped on the story, because this skews a little young for me, if I'm being perfectly honest. But I think artistically, you can't say anything negative about the movie. Last point, and before we grade this, this goddamn score and music supervision is so good.
Killer.
Yeah,
like
soundtrack and score are both incredible.
Yeah, I've seen people, talking about, like Oppenheimer as score of the year, which is incredible. Like I'm not trying to take anything away from Oppenheimer, but I just think that, like, and same with Spider-Verse, I feel like people have kind of underestimated the fucking muscle behind the sound design of this movie. Like, they did not take any shortcuts. It is fucking rich. The score and the soundtrack are both chef's kiss.
Yeah, I mean,
you're right, and they emphasize the energy of the, again, like the hip hop influence on the Turtles and the city, and then are able to. I mean, I already talked about how incredible I thought the Blackstreet montage was, that No Diggity montage. But also just Superfly talking in hip hop lyrics, and it's just, again, music felt so ingrained to the core of the film. It was a part of it.
Felt just as important as every other aspect of the movie. It felt just as important as the visual design and the voice acting, and it feels very cohesive in trying to capture this young urban energy.
Right, and it feels like it was kind of edited to the score. Like it's almost like, the movie has a BPM that's moving along with the score, which is just, great editing as well. But one of the reasons I enjoyed it, as a big lifelong, 9 Inch Nails Trent Reznor fan, since he's gone in more and more into film scores, he started out kind of just doing soundscapey stuff you would hear on like a Betweener track on a 9 Inch Nails album, and then now like very far away from that.
Trent Reznor with Atticus Ross.
Well, they've been working on 9 Inch Nails together as well.
I know. They are collaborators. I want to give credit where credit's due.
For sure. But here it seems like he's like given permission to do just like a hard-hitting industrial soundtrack, as hard as anything on like the Broken EP.
At Comic-Con, they specifically talked about we got to see a little preview of like, the opening sequence and stuff. And they specifically talked about how like they wanted it to sound like a garage band, and you're getting that through the lens of Trent Reznor, who has fucking, decades of experience on top of this kind of grungy industrial sound. It's just
and the way
so rich, and
the way that they're able to toggle from that into the hip hop scores and back and forth, you wouldn't think that would necessarily work, but it all comes together beautifully.
It's seamless. Yeah.
So what are we giving it, Alec? I'll let you go first. Grade it A to F.
Do you do a plus minus system, or is this
sure?
Yeah, you can do plus minus.
Look, I think it's an A minus for me, and if I could kind of chalk that up to just one basic sentence is, or as much as I can as a long-winded person, there's a feeling I've been chasing for so long, which is the feeling of walking out of X-Men or X-Men 2 and going, like, come on, Claws, go. And for the podcast, I made a fist and tried to make claws come out of my hand. And I think that feeling is unique to a specific stage of life. I think it's when you're able to believe in the fantasy, and I've chased that for so long as a film lover and entertainment lover. And this is probably the closest I've gotten to recapturing that in a long time. And I'm so excited at the idea of kids who are feeling that feeling for maybe not the first, but an early time with this movie, and pretending they have sai or nunchucks or a stick, which again, I love the way they use the stick. I think that for me, that's more important than whatever quibbles I have with like it, I wish I got more Bebop and Rocksteady than I got or whatever. So A minus for me.
Keith.
I 100% agree with you, Alec. A minus was my letter grade going into this. My criticisms or quibbles, they are, I would have liked a little bit more of this, or, maybe a little bit more of this, or whatever. But I feel like this movie's kind of lightning in a bottle. And I feel like it is able to capture an energy that I have not felt in a long, long time. And I, if this had come out in a year that didn't have a fucking Spider-Verse movie in it, to me, this would be like, oh man, this is slam dunk, the best animated feature I've seen this year. I just think it's so rich and unique, and trying to capture such a specific vibe while also making it appeal to the largest audience possible, which is a fucking tightrope to walk. So absolutely, I agree with everything you said. A- for me, and all of my quibbles are minimal at best.
I'm giving it a B. I liked it a lot.
Ooh, hiss.
You bitch.
I liked it a lot. I suspect the people within the age range it was made for are going to like it even more. It is a little kiddie for me personally. Some of the jokes don't land quite as well as I would have hoped, given Seth Rogen's involvement. But I totally understand why it was written the way it was written. I don't think the movie does as great of a job at tying together some of the plot threads. There's kind of two competing villains in the movie that they barely connect at one point. And because of that, there's some space in the middle of the movie where we're sort of in free fall before we're back on track again. But I think that it's I think it's a very unique movie. I love looking at it. It's artistically sound. One of the definitely, if not for me, probably the second best Ninja Turtles movie. But I am comparing that with my nostalgia for the '89.
I feel like to me this is parallel to me it's so different than the '89 movie.
It's
to me,
definitely this generation's version of it.
But the '89 version is a little darker. It is a little more adult. It is a little more story-wise cohesive. So to me it's kind of a toss-up, but I did not ever think that there would be a Ninja Turtles movie that would rival the original in my terms of quality.
And I think
the original has a technical Marvel element that's very hard to compare to, because those suits are so incredibly impressive. They
couldn't even recreate it for the sequels.
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, funny enough, if I were in my office, I would have a Turtles in Time poster behind me as well.
Oh, hell yeah.
Even though the movie's severely flawed, I have an affinity for it. And I'll say this too, and then we can stop talking about this casting. I'm sorry, but the original films, the 89, 90s films, I loved it, and I always wanted to hang out with the Turtles when I watched it, but I never felt like I was one of the Turtles. And I think part of that is a flaw of Casey Jones, and also just the size. They just look like such adults.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the films, through executive order, probably have pushed for an in where a kid can see themselves in it more. And I do think, even though he's been played by older men or middle-aged men or young teens, whatever it is, I do think Casey Jones as a character is often used as that, because it's hey, you're not a turtle, but you're like a young dude who could play hockey and fight and join with the Turtles. And so I'm so happy Casey's not in the film. I kind of hope he's not in the sequel either, or the show. I actually would love to keep Casey away from it for as long as possible, because I think this is the first time that you're really able to see yourself as a turtle. Obviously because they lean into the teenage element, but also because there were April was our kid, I suppose, but she was so active that she still felt like a member of the Turtles.
And you felt her from the Turtles lens. I thought it was a fun choice to have Leonardo crushing on her, and just this idea of there's this person outside of our social circle that is cooler than us that we want to hang out with. So she didn't feel like a Cypher character in the way that she could have. I do like that they treated the Turtles like Cyphers. Even though they're weird ninja mutants, we're going to make them the relatable ones. We're going to see it from their lens.
Let's go ahead and move on to the streaming homework, which Alec actually presented to us, and that is the Jim Jarmusch film Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai. And Keith, why don't you tell us what this movie's about?
Okay. Forrest Whitaker plays the titular ghost dog, who is a assassin for hire for a local mafioso character by the name of Louis. He accepts a job to hit a made man within the mafia family. And when he does it, there is a witness of a young woman who is the daughter of the mafia head at large, which is, largely why the hit was made. But because the circumstance behind his death was, it was witnessed and in a fashion that was not what they were expecting, this mafia family decides that this was too messy and they have to clean up all the loose ends, and they decide to put out sort of a contract on Ghost Dog. And a lot of the movie is just him and this mafia family sort of existing within the realms of a Jim Jarmusch narrative.
Right. And that was going to be how I would frame the review. Jim Jarmusch has a few different modes that he goes into. If he's not doing sort of these hangout, talky movies about, people in black and white cafes waxing philosophical about the world. Sometimes he'll take that tone and apply it to genre, whether it be like he did with Dead Man, the Western with Johnny Depp, or whether it be Only Lovers Left Alive, the vampire film, or a movie like this where he applies it to a crime narrative. And we've seen movies kind of like this before, that sort of takes the idea of the rogue samurai or the Ronin and sort of recast him as an inner city hitman, as we did with the movie Les Samurai, which we talked about on the podcast, the Melville film, or even Drive has elements of that.
Army of Shadows as well, which is like another take on the same story.
Right. Yeah. And where you have the sort of quiet killer who is at odds morally with his line of work, and how he kind of keeps people at arm's length, but also sort of yearns for something more normal.
And this idea of, this sort of honor amongst thieves, and this sort of code within the profession of he's a killer, but he has these rules that he abides by that separates him from from the sort of larger population of the criminal underworld that he might associate with.
Right.
Yeah. It's similar to also like Gloria, the John Cassavetes film, or any of these stories of the dangerous person that has to turn against the greater force it used to be aligned with, right?
Right.
But I think part of what's interesting with Ghost Dog, if we're going to get into it,
is
that he's not a Ronin. I mean, he is dedicated to a master that he serves, right?
Sure.
So he is all the way to the end of the film, without spoiling anything, he is dedicated not only to his code, but the master that the code tells him he needs to have. And I think that, obviously it's not an accident that I picked this one with, or suggested this one with Turtles, because it is obviously the hip hop element is a big part of it. RZA does the score for this and plays a very small role in it. And hip hop is a big part of this story. And it is this blend of Black culture and samurai culture, or in general, to be just like a little more broad, like martial arts culture.
Right. And Eastern philosophy and that kind of stuff.
And living in a place that you experience very differently, and because of that have found an external code that you're applying to it, right? So in Turtles, Splinter, his code and his rules are very severe and very clear, and Ghost Dogs are very clear. And I also just, again, and we don't have to harp on this part, but like just to add that these are also both stories that are New York hip hop stories by white directors, so it is through like a white lens. And I think that's also just like worth mentioning.
Well, and I think all of those things have this sort of intersection, right? Of there is a fascination within Black culture with like anime and samurai movies and ninjas, and a fascination with, within white culture of hip hop, and there is a Venn diagram, right, where all of these things cross over, and that's when you get stuff like Ninja Turtles and Ghost Dog,
right,
which I think is pretty cool.
I mean, RZA and Wu-Tang Clan in general, right? Like RZA could go toe to toe with anybody on martial arts knowledge. Like I don't know if y'all watch Nardwuar interviews or anything like that, but if you were to watch him, the man's knowledge is unfucking believable. I mean, there's a reason he also then goes on to make Man with the Iron Fists, and I think his collaboration with Jim Jarmusch is such an interesting thing. I mean, Jim and music are very tied. Obviously, like Tom Waits is in a lot of his films, and then just musicians in general. Like Wu-Tang's also in Smoking Cigarettes, but yeah.
And he tends to have a sort of as a director, he's sort of a jazz musician of direction, right? Like there's a tendency to sort of play out the scenes as much as they're going to go without necessarily, and I don't think this movie is an exception, but this idea of like, we're going to play it out for the vibes,
right,
versus the overall story structure.
I think a big part of Jarmusch's style has always been, that marries all of his different modes, is he's never really been a plot forward guy. Like his movies have plot. He's not totally divorced of it. But he's a lot more interested in feel. And he's a lot more interested.
It's feeling first, and let's get to the story through the feeling.
Right. And he's more interested in sort of the internal complexities of his characters and letting that play out. And he is a New York guy. His comeuppance was during the late 70s, early 80s, like punk and new wave and no wave movement, and making experimental films. And the punk culture kind of came up simultaneously with the Brooklyn hip hop culture, and were very linked. I mean, that's why the Beastie Boys ended up going from being a hardcore band to being a hip hop band in like a year, because those cultures were sort of parallel, and I think that it's interesting. It totally makes sense to me why Jarmusch would turn to RZA. I believe this is his first score too. And why he would include that in this movie in the way that he does. And I think comes out pretty explicitly in this film, even though it is kind of a take on a tried and true genre. The sullen, quiet hitman has to have one last, battle. Even going as far back to like westerns and things like that, they're kind of played with these ideas.
But I think structurally speaking, this movie it avoids a lot of the Western stuff, I think, by playing more into the sort of, Eastern samurai stuff meets New York.
Right.
Like it avoids the sort of, Sergio Leone feel of samurai movie through the lens of Western, which is very hard, I think, to divorce from that. But because it's set in such an urban element, and because Jim Jarmusch has such an eye for scene and for character, in letting these characters sort of breathe and live in these moments, it feels distinct from the sort of Quentin Tarantino vibe of it. And I love that the gangsters in this are all kind of fucking goofballs and old and not the most threatening, and
they feel like from another era, like the way they dress, the way that the big amber goggles that they're wearing, the chains and all that stuff, which you could say there's a parallel to hip hop culture as well, between flexing and wanting to show your wealth and that kind of stuff. In this movie, you do have one gangster who's like well into his like late 50s who can spit bars to like Public Enemy, like perfect. Yeah,
I love Public Enemy. But I think you're also tapping into another theme of the film, which is feeling out of time or feeling out of who you are does not fit into the way the world's changing around you, right?
The world's movie directly references this. Yeah. Like, it's not subtle about drawing these parallels to, Ghost Dog is a man whose honor exists out of time and place with where he is. And the same goes for these gangsters. They all exist within this world that has left them behind.
And they all kind of feel like they're playing gangster. Like, at first I didn't know how to take that. I thought, like, I don't know, these Goombas are like kind of a stereotypical to the point of being hard to take serious, until I realized that then I saw the girl with like the bobbed wig and everything. And I'm like, oh, okay, this is all intentional. Like
I think the most important detail as far as that goes is that they're back due on rent.
Yeah.
Right? Like these aren't the Goodfellas. These are just sort of goofballs who have been playing gangster for so long, but they can't afford their fucking meeting hall or whatever. And I think the movie brings it up multiple times, and I think intentionally, like, these guys aren't running the city. They want to run the city, and they understand a world where maybe they once would have, but they're also facing, difficult times. To me, that was the moment. Like, the second time the guy was like, "Come on, you guys owe me fucking rent," I was like, "Oh, fuck!" Like, that is brilliant.
No, just again, it's pushing this idea of you can't change the change around you, and it is why a code is so important, and it's why Ghost Dog latches on to the way of the samurai as instructed by the book so passionately, and so it's so hard to adapt or change and to survive within that. And the only way for us as a society, and I think this even ties back to the strike conversation and conversations we could have about greed and change, but without a code, without a set of ways to make yourself the best version of yourself, you'll drown or disappear. into society.
You know, this would have been around the time that they were making concerted efforts to clean up the city and change the image and make it feel more modern. And that really was a post 9/11 effort as well. But yeah, I think, you know, there might be a subtext here about, you know, the old characters of the city, the old city clashing with the new realities.
Yeah, I mean, Rudy Giuliani was cleaning up the streets and bullshit like that, right? Like, I mean, partially before, but then also anyone who's involved in this movie will have lived through watching Times Square change dramatically from the Paul Schrader hardcore version of Times Square to what, you know, now we would say like there's the Ryan Seacrest era of Times Square, right?
Sure.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, Jarmusch himself, having come up in the experimental film and the no wave scene from like the East Village and that area, he went, you know, all of those people were allowed to make the weird transgressive art that they were allowed to make because they could do it essentially squatting for like $50 a room in these cheap apartments, which all either got torn down or gentrified into oblivion. So, you know, he's very much on the front lines of like watching the city change.
The transfer of knowledge is very fascinating in this movie to me as well, because
the fascination with books I thought was really cool, and like the written word, and you know, the idea of like, read this story and tell me what you think about it. I really liked that.
Me
too. And obviously Rashomon as like one of the big books talked about in the film is also fascinating. And you know, now that I'm older, you know, I probably haven't watched this movie in about 7 years. It's been like a long time. That might not be true. Maybe like 4 or 5 years, but it's been a minute. And I do feel like I'm a little bit more experienced now and know a little bit more about the things that this film is referencing. And this just seems to get better and better every time I watch it. And I think part of that is because how clearly purposeful the texts transferred from person to person are. Rashomon, obviously, as a film, one of like the most important samurai movies ever made, but as a book, just also a fascinating piece of literary history. And then what were the other books that are used in this film? There were a few. I wish I took notes.
I remember there was there's a pretty funny scene where Ghost Dog is talking to Perline, and she just like sort of pulling like multiple books out of her lunchbox. I remember Frankenstein was one of them.
And they talk about liking the book better than the film.
And I also just think, you know, there's obviously a parallel there of like connecting to, you know, this sort of monster that's created by circumstance versus intent. I can't remember all the books.
It was like a smutty nurse, a night nurse.
The night nurse.
Yeah. That's what I liked about the movie as a whole is, you know, it works as a plot. I'm invested in the crime narrative and the revenge tale. All of that is fine enough. But the reason that it stands out, or the reason that really separates it from the others like it, is that it's more about the moments in between the moments that the movie usually pays attention to.
Yeah, and I think there's this huge focus on, you know, instead of plot with a capital P, like, you know, how many movies have we seen that are about this sort of revenge plot? But it focuses on these characters, and like you said, these sort of lived-in moments in between. You get to see these mafioso guys that are just kind of, in their own way, these dorky goombas. And, you know, Ghost Dog himself is kind of a dork. Like, I loved that he did this like flourish with his gun where he would
dork.
oh, he's a dork, but he's a cool dork. Like, when you're fucking flipping your silencer around and then sheathing it like it's your sword. I love it, but it's also like it doesn't. It informs the character. Like, it's not just this thing that's done to look cool, because he kind of doesn't look cool doing it.
Well, yeah, no, not at all. I mean, he looks. It's a silly thing to do and unnecessary, but that's kind of his character, right? He's so connected.
He's so into this idea of him as a samurai that these flourishes to him are necessary, and as a story, it's necessary. But like, anyone looking into this situation would be like, all right, you're kind of a dork. Like, you're an amazing killer, but
well,
I don't know if Forrest has ever looked cooler, though. I will say, I mean, with the braids and he's looking all fly.
I mean,
he has one line. One of my favorite parts is when he's quoting The Way of the Samurai, and he says, "From time to time, if you wake up and your skin is blemished from bad sleep, it might be necessary for a samurai to wear rouge." Yeah, and then it cuts to him stealing and wearing the fucking flyest suit ever. He's just in this unbelievably beautiful, crisp blue suit. He looks fucking sleek. He looks shiny and good. He's a bad motherfucker. I love that turn. I love that they talk about the aesthetic of the samurai being important, because again, to hip hop and yeah.
I think this is one of his best performances, and a great platform to show what he can do. Unfortunately, he's been around for so long now. I mean, going as far back as Animal House? Was he in that? He was in
Fast
something.
Times, I think, is maybe.
Was it Fast Times? Fast Times. You're right.
He's a quarterback or a linebacker or something, and he's a football player in the film. Small part, but he's in it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's been in, a ton of movies since, and he's always a working actor, and he's always very committed to whatever he's in, whether he's in A pictures or B pictures. And unfortunately, I feel like after The Last King of Scotland, his star has kind of faded, and he's been doing more and more kind of like B pictures and low grade sort of copycat movies and things like that. But
he's in Black Panther, man. I mean, it was $1 billion. Now, granted, it's a smaller part, but he's in hits. In general, a thing I could complain about modern Hollywood is that we have pulled away from these kind of odder looking character actors in a way that is really unfortunate. And like, I think so much about Bob Hoskins and him as an actor, and also as a figure of sensuality, and how earlier films with him, like
well, you would not have had him.
He's a sexual character. He's a sexual being, and I think there's this movement away from that. As movies get less sexual, they somehow are also more pretty, and there is something lost. Because Forrest does not become a worse actor. If Who
Framed Roger Rabbit was made today, Bob Hoskins would not have been the lead.
Right. And if Mermaids were made today, Cher would not. That's the film, right? Mermaids. Yeah. Cher would not be fucking Bob Hoskins. But in that movie, he's so tender and interesting, and again, sexual, and we're not afraid of it. And I feel that way about Forrest Whitaker.
It's unfortunate that Forrest Whitaker has probably been competing with Lawrence Fishburne for every role that either of them have been up for the last 15, 20 years. Like that, you know what I mean?
And you could also say the same thing about his career as well. I think both of them have struggled a little bit as they've gotten older. And the only reason I bring that up is because for people of a certain generation who are maybe they've never seen him allowed to be good and allowed to see him holding down an entire
movie.
His
teeth into a real role.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That they should definitely take a look at this and see Forrest at its best. But yeah, I really enjoyed the movie. We don't typically grade our streaming homework because, the history is usually enough to kind of to kind of go on that. But I mean, I'm a big Jarmusch fan, generally speaking. I haven't loved every single movie I've seen of his, but I'm always interested in what he does. And this is up there, I think, with the best of his work.
I enjoyed this movie a lot. At first, I was a little reticent of it because it's, I will say, glacially paced. And maybe it was one of those things that I maybe was putting off for too long, and then was like, fuck, I gotta make sure I watch this movie. But I also think that, sometimes that is the best circumstance to watch a movie, is like, I need to watch this and to just let it overtake me, because this did. Like, I think the characters are so strong, and the world is so, like, this feels sort of anti-Tarantino to me. And like, instead of taking this seedy underworld and glossing over making the coolest version of it, it's like, okay, let's make these people feel as real and lived in as possible and take all the sort of shine away from that. I think it's one of the most unique approaches I've seen to the sort of samurai narrative. And I've watched, a ton of movies that have been influenced by that and drawn from that. I ended up having a ton of fun with this, even though it wasn't maybe the sort of John Wick fun that I was originally anticipating.
Yeah, it's a lot closer to the Joaquin Phoenix, Lynn Ramsey flick. You Were Never Really Here. That's very slow, vibey thing. I mean, I rewatched it this morning because I'm on strike. I don't have a job, and so I, after finishing it, turned on an old Tribe Called Quest music video, and then basically played through 90s and early 2000s hip hop music videos for like 3 hours. And if anyone listening feels at all compelled to listen to a suggestion by me for some reason, I would love nothing more than for someone on a weekend, preferably in their home or a friend's home, to smoke the largest, fattest blunt that they can get their hands on and watch this movie, and then just allow that vibe to really continue with you. And then hopefully maybe go put on an old Wu-Tang album or affiliate, Jizz's Liquid Swords or something. I mean, I just think there's, again, talking about like energies captured with Turtles, and now again with this is a uniformly felt energy, or rather not uniformly, I'm sorry, that's not the right word. This is an energy that is felt among an entire collective of people, right? And I think it crosses genre lines and racial lines and class lines to a degree, and absolutely generational. Yeah, brilliant addition. Thank you. And I think any film that can recapture something like that, like a collective feeling so effectively, is worth absorbing yourself into. And for me, and this film, sitting and allowing yourself to be captured by the vibe and allowing yourself to be just like a little bored for a little bit, like which is one of the most powerful things a human being can do. I think it's something I'm really trying to get better about. Be bored for like 20 minutes because the shit pays off. Like, it's for me.
Yeah. And I don't want it to sound like this movie's boring, because I don't think it is. But it's not instantly gratifying.
It takes some acclimation, Do you
remember when Drive came out and that woman was mad that it wasn't a Fast and the Furious movie?
I do. Yeah.
Totally. I think if you go into this thinking it's John Wick, you're gonna probably be bummed. But if you go into this thinking it's closer to Drive, then
and the log line makes it sound like that, right? Like it's about an assassin who gets double-crossed in a job and has to go against his masters, and like on paper that sounds very action forward.
Yeah.
And it could be in another screenplay, it would be. I ended up loving this movie for not being that, not being as easy like I liked the quirks and the, there's this fucking hilarious bit with his best friend who only speaks French, and they keep saying the same thing to each other, but they don't understand each other, and it's just this beautiful moment that you would not get if you didn't let the movie breathe.
Right.
And there's a beauty to that.
Right.
It's the type of thing you can only get away with if you're Jim Jarmusch, who admittedly I'm probably split on as a director. Like I thoroughly enjoy, this is for sure my favorite movie of his, but I thoroughly enjoy a bunch of his stuff. And I also don't get some of his stuff.
Neither do I. Like, there are movies
that was my polite way of saying I actively dislike.
Yeah, I mean, the zombie thing he did a few years ago, I thought was a hot mess.
Dead Don't Die.
But Only Lovers Left Alive was like one of my favorite movies the year it came out. I mean, that was, and I love, his older movie, the black and white stuff like Down by Law and Strangers in Paradise. And, I'm just a big fanboy for that era of like gritty underground film. But yeah, so thank you for bringing that to us, and thank you for being on the show. Thank you for talking to us about the strike and divulging what you were allowed to divulge, and giving us your honest opinions and thoughts about the future of how these negotiations should or should not go. Now, before I close us out with all of our social media and blah, 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 where do you want to direct people to?
Oh, for me?
Yes.
I mean, my only social is Twitter, really. So you're welcome to follow me. It's a mix of bad takes and thirst trap photos. So do that. Do what you will with that information. If you want to support me in any kind of reasonable way, you're welcome to reach out to me or my reps and try to meet with me about something. I may have a comic book next year to plug, but I actually don't know if that's going to happen, so maybe that's not worth bringing up. And then
I will want to know more about that in the future. So
yeah, look, hey, I'll come back on if it comes out. I'll come back on and do. I'm telling you, I'm going to come on your podcast.
Absolutely,
sure, yeah.
Press and do promo for my own fucking bullshit.
You're always welcome.
But beyond that, oh, you're very kind. Thank you. But yeah, you're more than welcome to watch True Lies on Paramount Plus if you want to. It's a CBS procedural. It's really fun. I'm very proud of it. If you have to watch any episode, please make it episode. Ah, shit, we changed the order. I think it's 8. Episode 8 now. It's my favorite episode. Harry and Helen team up with a set of communist spies from Cuba to save the world together. And my opinions are all over it. It's great.
Cool. Cool.
My favorite bit.
Just to make it a little easier for people, what is your Twitter handle?
Oh yeah. It's just Alec Engerson. It's an E for Engerson and an A for Alec. And there you go.
All right. And who represents you again, in case people were interested?
Yeah, represented by Gersh Agency and Rain Management, Lyra Tan at Gersh and Dallas Lindley. I'm at Rain. Thank you both if you listen to this. I love you.
Cool. Yeah, no, please listen to this.
All right. If anybody has anything to say about anything we've talked about on this podcast or previous, you can reach out to us at our email at MacGuffinPod@gmail.com. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram, Letterboxd, TikTok, YouTube. We now have a YouTube version of the podcast with timestamps if you want to skip around to specific reviews. Please subscribe to us on Spotify or iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating and a 1-sentence review. It helps us move up in the algorithm and puts us in front of more eyeballs. Also, word of mouth. Just tell a friend. And you can follow me individually at my Twitter and Instagram at BC Cassidy. You can also read the reviews I post for the Idaho State Journal, Googling Idaho State Journal movie reviews or Idaho State Journal Arts and Entertainment, and that'll take you to where they archive the reviews. And be sure to read the other articles and reviews by the rest of the MacGuffin staff at MacGuff.in.
And you can follow me on pretty much all the socials, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, at Keith Foster Kid. And if you're interested in seeing me perform, I do live comedy at Mockingbird Improv. I am part of the show's Lyrics and Laugh and improv versus stand-up. So you can check those out at mockingbirdimprov.org.
Okay. And
That's cool. That's awesome. I didn't know you did that.
that is the end of the episode.
Humans are the demon scum of the earth. Avoid them. Don't say hi. They lust to murder that which is different for them. To interact with them is to die.